Hosea, the last prophet to get to try to persuade Israel to turn from their wicked ways. Remember that the book is really divided into two halves. You have the first 3 chapters about the relationship with Hosea and Gomer as his wife, the adulterous relationship and how that panned out. And then the chapters 4 through the rest of them, 14, deal with basically God and Israel's relationship, kind of as a husband and a wife, and the adulterous relationship that they had with God. So we finished chapter 5 last week, and we're going to begin on chapter 6. Honestly, I don't think I'm going to be able to get through the rest of the book, just because probably I like to talk too much. But if we don't finish, then that's okay. Patricia and I are leaving next Thursday, and Jay and Serena too, for Tennessee to see Matt and Kara. So we're going to be gone for a few weeks, and probably, Wayne, if it's okay with you, I'll just pick it up when I get back. But we can talk about that. Yeah. Okay, chapter 6. Chapter 6 begins with a little bit of biblical scholar controversy. Some believe that the first 3 verses of chapter 6 should be at the end of verse 15 in chapter 5. If you go back, we're talking about the eventual restoration of Israel here. Verse 15 of chapter 5, I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. They will seek my face. In their affliction they will diligently seek me. Then you go right into verse 1 of chapter 6. Come and let us return to the Lord. And you can read the rest there. If that is so, the chapter division is unfortunate, okay, the way it is. But many other scholars believe it is tied to verse 4 of chapter 6 and to the rest of the chapter. And if we view it in that way, what Hosea is talking about is insincerity. Insincerity is an abomination to God. Okay? Now my question to you is, insincerity about what? What are they insincere in doing? That's right. It's about repentance. Their hearts are not with God, as Jack said, which is very true. Look at verse 4, if you would. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like morning cloud, and like the early dew, it goes away. What is he talking about here? Well, look at verse 6. That'll give you the answer. It says, for I, meaning God, desire what? Loyalty, mercy in some translations, and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Just like Adam broke the covenant God made with him, and for that he was expelled from the Garden of Eden. We know that story. So Israel broke the covenant they had with God, and now would be expelled from their land. Verses 8 through 10, you see the whole land of Israel had become a refuge for murderers. Look what it says, Gilead, and we'll talk about that city in a little bit. It's not really a city, it's a place. Gilead is a city of evildoers and is defiled with blood, as bands of robbers lie in wait for man. Even priests are there. Even priests are there. One of the things it talks about here, no such city as Gilead mentioned in the Bible. Gilead is a mountainous district east of the Jordan and served as a retreat for wicked men, as you see here. Notice in verse 11, also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed for you. What does that mean? Your up and comings is coming. That's right. We're going to talk about same thing Joel told him. Yeah. Judah will pay also. Judah will pay also. Any thoughts or comments? Yes.
Loyalty rather than sacrifice reminds me of when God got rid of Saul as king when he disobeyed him about going in and getting rid of all those evil people.
Right.
And to sacrifice, to obey is better than to sacrifice the fat of ram. And God said, because you rejected me, that's a rejection of God, and I'm rejecting you.
That's right.
So,
Good point. Same kind of idea. Absolutely right. Other thoughts or comments? Jack.
It's what the heart is. Not a physical worship. It's in here, and that's what God wants. He wants your heart. Now, you can do things physical, and that doesn't mean a thing.
We can come here, sit in these nice padded chairs, sing to our hearts, as best we can, and everything. But unless your heart is in the right place, it's insincere. And that's what we're talking about here. Good comment. Any others? Okay. Let's go on to chapter 7. Actually, 7 and 8 are kind of tied together. The prophet here, Hosea, exposes Israel's corrupt political conditions and the consequences that must follow. Chapter 7. In this chapter, we'll see that the wickedness of Israel seems endless. The situation described in this chapter is total anarchy. The people were no longer safe in their homes or in their streets. Thieves and troops of robbers collaborate with the king in carrying out his wicked plots. Notice in verses 4 through 7. They are all adulterers. Like an oven heated by a baker, he ceases stirring a fire after the dough, kneading. After kneading the dough, until it is leavened. In the day of our king. Some think the plot, wicked companions of the king. This is what it's about. The thought seems to be the wicked companions of the king plot his overthrow. Notice in verse 5 where it says, in or on the day of our king. Got to find my place here. I lost it. I'm sorry. Verse 5. In the day of our king, or some of your translations say on. Now we don't know what that is for sure. This is either maybe his birthday, an anniversary, maybe a day of feast. But what happens is they plan to strike. Remember we talked about earlier that during Hosea's ministry, 6 kings came and went. 4, maybe 5 were murdered, and 1 was carried away. And we read more about that in 2 Kings chapter 15. 1 lasted 6 months, 1 only lasted 1 month. That's how quick they came and went. The saddest part of this picture is seen in the statement of Jehovah God himself. Look at the last part of verse 7. It says, there is none among them who calls upon me. Isn't that sad? Nobody. The whole place had gone downhill. In verse 8, we read it this way, Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Ephraim is a cake unturned. What does that first part mean? Ephraim has mixed himself among the peoples. Any thoughts on that? Took up the ways of the world, yes? Yep. They've associated themselves with the heathen nations around them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Very good. Very good. The breaking of the ancient covenant is stressed. God has specifically commanded that Israel was not to intermingle with the pagan nations. He made that point very clear. And why? If we turn over to Psalms 106. And in verses 35 and 36, it reads, but they mingled with the Gentiles and learned their works. They served their idols, which became a snare to them. And then in verse 39 of that same chapter, it says, thus they were defiled by their own works and played the harlot by their own deeds. That's what happens when they mix together. What happens when they mix together? Now, the second part of that, I like this. Ephraim is a cake unturned. What does that mean? Half-baked, yes. That's exactly what it means. It has to do with a flawed personality, okay? You know, if something is not turned when it's cooking in the oven, ladies and guys who cook, what happens? It burns on one side and it's raw on the other side. And that term, half-baked, really comes into play here. Something you don't want to be called. Something you don't want to be called. I like that. Leaves a little to the imagination. Look at verse 11. It says, Ephraim also is like a silly dove without sense. They call to Egypt, they go to Assyria. What is Hosea talking about when he talks about silly dove? Remember, there's a lot of metaphors and symbology here. Silly dove. Yeah. They go from place to place. They kind of, Wayne, go ahead. Yes. What does it mean to flit about, F-L-I-T, or flitted? Yeah, no directional, just kind of, like that. And that's what happened here. Ephraim is flitted with Egypt and Assyria, calling upon each for help. He went to their enemy. How, in the eyes of the Assyrians and the Egyptians, even though that doesn't really matter, what's the word I'm trying to find? How bad it was for Ephraim to do something like that, or Israel, to ask for their help, their enemies. It really showed how far they had sunk. Yeah. He's Jack.
God.
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't put the trust in God. It goes on even verse 8.
They're playing both ends to the middle. And that never works. Never works. Yes, Mark.
Back where you had us.
Here, I'm going to have you use this so everybody hears.
Back where you had us look at Psalms just a couple minutes ago.
Yeah.
I read just a little bit farther, and they sunk so low that they even offered their own sons and daughters as human sacrifices to these idols.
Yep.
I mean,
oh yeah,
that's bad.
That's down the bottom.
Yeah.
That's down the bottom of the pit. Yeah. No, very good comment. Yes, Jeanette.
God told them when they went into the land of Canaan, do not marry into them. They will tempt you to worship their gods, and you will intermarry with them, and will forget your God. Moses told them that.
Yeah.
Don't do it. And that's why they were to destroy those people, which sounds very harsh to us today. Go in and destroy those people. But I heard a speaker say that they have gone through and found bones of those ancient Canaanites that were there, and they were so riddled with all kinds of venereal diseases. They had sunk so low there was no redemption left. Even the children's bones were riddled with all kinds of, they can test these bones. And
sure.
Was riddled with all sorts of disease and things. God did not want that kind of disease in his people, and he didn't want their sin disease in his people. If they didn't do it, now they're paying the consequences.
As I remember, Moses tried to stamp all that out. He even killed 25,000, I think it was. But it still went on. Still went on. Yes?
That seems terrific. But, God created all this.
Yep.
He will do whatever he wants to with it. And we try to rationalize it as human beings, and we can't think like God. And it's his creation to do with it as he pleases.
It amazes me in this study, all God wants from us is our heart. Do the right thing. But yet, these people never got, ups and downs, roller coaster. Good comment. Any others? One of the things on that last verse 11, neither Egypt or Assyria had any interest in Israel except to invade and plunder it. Look at, please, verse 13, where it says, "Woe to them." What has caused the word woe to come out? Beware their sins. They have wandered far from God, as we've been talking about. Now, verse 16 is an interesting verse. They return, but not to the Most High. They are like a deceitful bow. Their princes shall fall by the sword for the cursings of their tongue. This shall be their derision in the land of Egypt. You know, verse 16 gives the impression that they are returning to God, but they don't. That word deceitful bow, interesting. What comes to mind when you hear that word? Don't shoot straight. Yeah. Defective. Watch your back. Yeah. You're going to miss the mark, right? Yeah, that's what it's about. Either flawed, made wrong, misses the mark, any of those things. That's what he's saying here. Any thoughts or questions more on chapter 7? Okay, let's look at chapter 8. The shift of emphasis here in this chapter is to the broken covenant between God and Israel. Chapter 8 is basically a summary of those sins. In the first 7 verses of chapter 8, we see certain and inevitable judgment coming. Verse 1, set the trumpet to your mouth. I forget what other translations say off the top of my head, but basically it's sound the warning. The Assyrians are coming. Why? Because, as we talked about, they transgressed my covenant. They have rebelled against my law. Verse 1. Verse 2. Israel will cry to me, my God, we know you. Does that sound sincere? Kinda. I mean, honestly. But guess what? It's too late. Verse 3, here it is. Israel has cast off the good. The enemy will pursue them. In other words, the destruction begins. The destruction begins. Verse 5. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long will it be until they attain innocence? Many biblical scholars here are unwilling to see in this verse the existence of a golden calf idol in Samaria. We had Dan and Bethel. Okay? Jeroboam set that up, right? Okay? Now, you may remember that Samaria had not been built when Jeroboam set up the calves at Dan and Bethel. So, the singular use of the word here indicates that a calf was in Samaria. Or else Hosea would have said calves, right? Keep in mind here, Samaria is the word often used, and we talked about this, as a name for all of Israel. But if that had been the usage here, calves would have been in the plural. I haven't gone to Burton Kaufman's commentary very much in this study. I've stayed with Homer Haley. But I did while I was in the hospital. I got to tell you, you had a bed and you had a couch that had a table in the middle, recliner on one end, and at this table I could spread all my literature out during the day and work on my lesson. Nurses come in and go, what are you doing? I told them the story. I'm co-teaching a Bible class, and we're talking about the minor prophets. And some of them asked questions. It was kind of neat. But I had some time here, and so I printed off the commentaries Burton Kaufman has for Hosea so that I had another reference. And Burton Kaufman says, some are quick to point out that there is no other Old Testament mention of a calf at Samaria. And then he goes on to say, but what of it? He says, God needs to say it only once. And there's a point there. There's a point there. So, I don't know which side you want to take, but it's interesting to see the difference in the two. Homer Haley disagrees and says the calf at Samaria is the calf of the gold erected at Bethel, and it had come from the hands of Israel. Irregardless of who's right, what did it do? Read on. It angered God. Angered God. My anger is aroused against them. Look at what is going to happen in verse 7. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud, it should never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. Going back to the first two lines of verse 7. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. What does that mean to you? Yeah, a cyclone. A cyclone. It reminds me of what Paul told the church in Galatia in chapter 6, 7, where he says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. How true of a statement is that? I think that's what they're talking about. They sow the whirlwind, but boy, look out. Katie, bar the door. A cyclone is coming. Any thoughts more on that? Okay. Verses 8 through 10 talk about Israel's appeal to the other nations for help. It will be futile. It will only add to their present problems. I want to point out one thing in verse 12. It says, I have written for him the great things of my law. Other translations say, is it 10,000? 10,000, yeah. I wrote for him 10,000 things of my law. What Hosea is referring to here is the complete fullness of God's law in the covenant that he had made with man and with the nation of Israel. The covenant was a specific and detailed thing. Okay? It concerned practically every aspect of life that the people would come in contact with. There should be no questions, yet Israel rejected it and did their own thing. Simply could not follow the rules. Verse 13, the last part, says, they shall return to Egypt. Are they really going to Egypt? No. Egypt really means they're going back into captivity, back into bondage. And then again, we see another warning for Judah in verse 14. For Israel has forgotten his maker and has built temples. Judah has also multiplied fortified cities, but I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his palaces. When you see that word about they made fortified cities, what they're trying to do is defend themselves. And without God's help, that's futile. And God's going to show them that it's futile. That's exactly right. Exactly right. Trust in themselves. Yes, Mark. People enjoy your comments, but they can't hear you sometimes.
Oh, okay. One of the things it seems to me is people aren't much different because God is so patient, and I think sometimes we deceive ourselves. Well, I went to this idol worship. The sky did not fall down. God didn't strike me dead with a lightning bolt or send down fire and brimstone. So it must be okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's a real poor way to think. We should be thinking when we allow ourselves to be tempted and do things that God has forbidden us. Wow, God's given me a little more time to repent, get my act together, and, stop doing this, just because nothing really bad happened the first time or the second time doesn't mean that's okay with God.
Yeah. But what comes to mind is we don't learn from our mistakes. I mean, what better way to learn something is to try something and mess it up and figure out the right way. I mean, that's, to me, one of the best ways to learn. School of hard knocks, maybe. Any thoughts or comments? Yes, Mary. It's definitely a challenge, but then also think of the joy if that person converts. Think about that side of it. Yeah, it's tough. When they talk about unequally yoked, I think that is part of what you're talking about, because it's hard. Yeah. 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 The preference is obviously to marry somebody of same faith, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes we fall in love with somebody else, and love is strong. Other thoughts or comments? Okay, moving on to chapter 9. Yes, please.
Because there's a lot of folks that feel that way.
Right.
Marrying someone out of the faith is also a way of evangelizing. My wife was not a Christian when I married her.
Patricia, so.
Right. So, but here's the thing. Here's the difference between then and now. In the Old Testament times, when you married out of your faith, you were out of the faith because the only way you could be an Israelite was to be born into that nation. In the kingdom of Christ, the New Testament kingdom, you are admitted into the family when you are baptized into Christ. So it's a little bit different. There was no way for an outsider to become an Israelite. But there certainly is for an outsider to become a Christian.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think there's a difference too in it. If they have a common belief in God and not an idolatrous God, that makes a difference too.
Yeah. It's like some of the nurses that were in the hospital. One asked me, "Well, what church you go to?" And I told her. Then I asked her, "What church do you go to?" And it was a community church, but she was kind of had some biblical knowledge and stuff, and we talked a little while. You had a hand go up for a moment.
I was just going to say, I kind of feel bad for a lot of the kids growing up in the church today because so many of the congregations are getting smaller and smaller, and going to a Church of Christ college, Harding, Pepperdine, Reed Hardman, that's no guarantee.
Right.
I mean, I've seen so many that I grew up with. When they came out of there, they were married to every denomination you can think of. I have a nephew he's a preacher for one. He went to Harding. But I still think it's best, if at all possible, because God didn't create man to be He saw one good man be alone.
Right.
If at all possible, give yourself a chance. I really lucked out when Patsy tapped me on the shoulder and asked me if I'd take her for a ride on my Harley Davidson motorcycle. My older brother married a Lutheran, converted her. She's a wonderful Christian lady. Been a real blessing to him and their children and everything. My mother married a non-Christian, and she got him to go to a gospel meeting. And before the meeting was finished and he was baptized, I mean, he just hit the ground running and he never looked back.
There you go.
He wanted to do everything. He wanted to lead singing. He wanted to teach Bible class. He wanted to preach. But I think stories like that, I think that's good, but give yourself a chance.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's like Matthew met Kara on churchofchristSingles.com. She was just about ready to take her profile off, and she saw Matthew, and she winked at Matthew, and Matthew winked back. So, end of the story. So anyway, all right, chapter 9. As well as in chapter 10, we will look at the judgments of Israel by God. We're going to touch upon the judgment of dispersion, the judgment of barrenness, meaning without children, and the judgment of destruction. Look at verse 1 of chapter 9. Oh, do not rejoice, O Israel, with a joy like other peoples, for you have played the harlot against your God. You have loved for reward on every threshing floor. Whether you take Homer Haley's position or not, that when it says, do not rejoice or rejoice not, depending on your translation, that Israel was enjoying a possible, let's call it a stay of execution, if you will, or punishment from the Assyrians, that the Assyrian threat had been lifted. And we get that thought, if you would, turning over to 2 Kings. This is kind of, I think, an important. 2 Kings chapter 15. And it reads beginning in verse 19. I'll wait a minute for those turning. 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 19. It says, Paul, king of Israel, came against the land. And Menahem, who was the king of Israel at the time, gave Paul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to strengthen the kingdom in his hand. And Menahem exacted the money from Israel, from all the very wealthy, from each man 50 shekels of silver, to give to the king of Assyria. So the king of Assyria turned back and did not stay there in the land. That's where that thought comes from, that maybe there was a reprieve for a little bit. Or, if you take the position of Burton Kaufman, that this verse is not just a mere prohibition of Israel's rejoicing in a good harvest, but the key to understanding this verse is what is meant in where it says, Oh, do not rejoice, O Israel, with joy like people. Like people. And I think some of your translations say joy of the peoples or something like that. What is like the peoples? Or like other peoples? Who represents the peoples? That's right. All those, the immoral, sexually deviant, the Baal-worshipping people. That's what he's talking about. This leads to the second line of verse 1. Because they have transgressed my covenant. I'm sorry, I got the wrong one. The threshing floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. Hosea explains what part of their punishment will be. Look at verse 3. They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, again bondage, and shall eat unclean things in Israel. They are going to be exiled into a foreign land, and now they face the people there. They would not dwell in God's or Jehovah's land anymore. Ephraim, the person Ephraim, okay, he had been born in Egypt, he had come out of the land, would now return to Egypt and eat unclean food in Assyria. The return to Egypt is again symbolic, not literal. Israel would return to bondage, which the Egypt signifies when they use that word. Okay? And look what they give up. No wine offerings. Their sacrifices would not be pleasing. All the beautiful and wonderful things in which they had rejoiced that God gave them would become possession of their captors. Okay, over in verses 10 through 17, or actually starting in 9, I want to talk about a little bit 3 places. In verse 9, you see that it reads, "They are deeply corrupted as in the days of Gibeah." Then in verse 10, about the 4th line down, 5th line, "But they went to Baal Peor." And then look at verse 15, the beginning of it. "All their wickedness is in Gilgal." What Hosea is doing here is using repeated references to historical events that shows Israel's rejection from God. They didn't learn. They didn't learn. How sad. In verses 10 through 17, we see that the judgment of barrenness is going to happen. Look at the last part of verse 11. No birth, no pregnancy, and no conception. Now, to the Jews, this was a mark of divine disfavor. Israel was known for their prolific birth rate. In other words, they had way too much time on their hands. And we see that in turning over to Exodus 1:7. Very beginning, Exodus 1:7. It reads, "But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." Another indication of this ability to multiply was the hatred and fear of the Egyptians, who countered the threat of this ability to reproduce when the Pharaoh commanded back in Exodus 1:22, all the newborn males be thrown into the Nile. He was concerned, very concerned. And if they should conceive and bear children, God would, notice in verse 12, He would bereave them to the last man. Bereave. When we think of that word, we think of sadness, maybe bereavement of a lost one. And that's exactly what he's saying here. It's to, if you're going to bereave them of their children down to the last person, this would have a profound effect on them. Okay, it means to take away and leave devastated. Any thoughts? Okay, look at the last 3 verses of chapter 9. Talk about how it was Gilgal, which is located in the Jordan Valley, northeast of Jerusalem, that many blessings from God was bestowed in the beginning. I want to read a comment from Haley's handbook here. Okay. Haley says it was there. We're talking about Gilgal now. It was there that Israel camped and ate the first of the produce of the land when they came up out of Egypt. And it was there that stones had been set up in memory of their passing over Jordan. This reproach of their failure to circumcise, keeping the covenant of Abraham, had been rolled away. At Gilgal, the covenant of divine appointment of Saul as king had been renewed, and there he had been anointed. Interesting comments by Haley there on that. But we see now that idolatry to the highest, most despicable degree has taken hold, and God will cast them away. These are the judgments: dispersion, barrenness, and then we're going to get into destruction here in a minute. Any thoughts on chapter 9 that had the 2, dispersion and barrenness? Okay, let's look at 10. 10 discusses the judgment of destruction. In verse 1, in this verse, the big thing appears in the false manner that Israel used their prosperity. Look at what it says here. Israel empties his vine. He brings forth fruit for himself, according to the multitude of his fruit. He has increased the altars, and he's made more, according to the bounty of his land. They have embellished his sacred pillars. What does it mean, or what do you think about When people who are wealthy, the way they spend their money, what does that tell you about them? Where their priorities are. Isn't it indicative of what the heart is, where the heart is? I think so. Very, very much so, in fact. What people did with their prosperity was indicative of the direction of their heart. Is that true today? Certainly true today. Without doubt. Comment is likewise true. Because their hearts were not in the right place, the punishment of destruction begins. Look at verse 2. Break down the altars, ruin the sacred pillars. Verse 3. No real king. They abandoned Jehovah. They only have now puppet kings, if you will. Verse 4. Judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of the field. What hemlock we talked about is a poisonous plant, very deadly. You certainly don't want that. Verse 5. Beth Aven, which you may remember we talked about as the place or house of vanity, gone. And then in verse 8 it says, all the false places of worship were destroyed and will be destroyed. In verse 10, when it is my desire, I will chasten them. Peoples shall be gathered against them when I bind them for their two transgressions. I will chasten them refers to what? To the judgment, doesn't it? That's about to fall on them. That comment, their two transgressions, have biblical scholars really divided exactly what that means. Some say it could be the calves at Dan Bethel. There's two there, right? Some say it was the idols and man-made kings they put in place. Okay? Most think it refers to the rejection of Him as God and as their king. Verse 11 is an interesting metaphor. Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain. Heifer, we know, is a female young cow, hasn't had a calf yet. When it becomes pregnant and has one, then it becomes a cow. Train that loves to thresh grain. What does it mean when we talk about loves to thresh grain? Why would an animal love to thresh grain? Eat all you want. Okay, we're told, I believe it's in, I think I wrote it down. Deuteronomy 25 and 4. In fact, let's turn there. I like this. Yeah. I'm sorry, Deuteronomy 25 and 4. I'll get there. Yeah. Verse 4 of Deuteronomy 25 says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. One of the reasons it gets to eat all it wants to. Free meal. And where it talks about, but I harnessed her fair neck, that's the yoke, the bondage that's going to be put upon Israel. Then in verses 12 through 15, and we'll end up with this, the prophet Hosea calls the people to return to righteousness, but with little hope of response, they have gone too far. Let me read what 12 says. Sow for yourself righteousness, reap in mercy. Does that mean that you can earn or you can merit salvation? Can we earn salvation? Isn't salvation a grace gift from God? Yeah. But yes, we have to do our part. Okay? I mean, back in 1 John, way in the back, 1 John chapter 3, verse 7. John writes, little children, let no one deceive you. He who practices righteousness is righteous, just as He, meaning God, is righteous. We need to do our part. We need to do our part. Verse 14, real quick. Shalman plundered, the last part of it, Shalman plundered Beth Arbel in the day of the battle. Mother dashes in pieces upon her children. We're not sure about this comment. Probably refers to Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. The destruction of Beth Arbel is unknown, but must have been bad enough that it was known to Israel. And that's the point we're trying to make here. I know I rushed this last, and I'm a little bit over, but any thoughts or comments as we close? Thank you so much. Appreciate your comment. We'll pick up someday, sometime, chapter 11.